It is time, right? Yeah.
Yep. I think Vishaka's away, so we'll be okay. Vishaka's back. All right. Yep. Read all over to you.
I'm sharing. Okay. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm Reed. I guess I'm the chair for the finals of the VITDT. So I'd like to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll yield the floor to the Prime Minister. All right. I'd like to call this House to order and request the Prime Minister to present a speech not to exceed 7 minutes on the motion. This House believes that Imran Khan should pivot away from China and towards India. Here.
China is a deeply immoral actor, and the ongoing relationship between Pakistan and China has prevented Pakistan from meaningfully criticizing that relationship. China is a predatory economic partner that takes and gives very little back, and the ongoing relationship between China and Pakistan has continued to destabilize the region in a deeply dangerous fashion. There will be 3 points in this speech. Firstly, I'll tell you about why this enables criticism of the Chinese regime and why principally that will win us the debate. Secondly, I'll explain why this would be a better move for Pakistan. And finally, I'll explain why this makes regional tension a lot better. Firstly, 2 points of setup. The first point of setup is this does not look like entirely cutting ties with China, but it does look like meaningfully reducing those ties and making the ties with India much stronger. Secondly, this does not just extend to economic ties, this also extends to military and diplomatic ties. Let's talk about the first point, why this enables criticism of the Chinese regime and why that is so important to the debate. The first thing to note is that Imran Khan has not criticized China on its treatment of Uyghur Muslims, has not criticized China in its over-surveillance of its people, and has not criticized China for any of the actions that it has taken that has deeply destabilized the nation of China. Now, consider his action to the vast majority of other countries with this kind of behavior, particularly with respect to the oppression of Muslim individuals. It is an entirely asymmetric relationship, yeah? And in the absence of strong economic ties that China can hold over Pakistan's head and say, we will likely cut these and you will be left out to dry, Imran Khan has a greater ability to meaningfully criticize China. Why is it so important that Imran Khan criticizes China, particularly for its egregious treatment of Uyghur Muslims? The first thing to note is that as a member of the global community and as a world leader, he has an independent moral obligation to criticize China for these actions. That is for the reason that to not do so is paramount to denying those actions from happening or tacitly endorsing those actions from happening. And there exists an independent moral harm to such action. For instance, if there existed a huge swathe of individuals who were being genocided, it would not be legitimate to say that we ought not to recognize those individuals, even if it inflamed tensions, even if it made the economic situation of your nation worse, for the reason that those individuals' suffering deserves to be recognized. Secondly, and most importantly, Imran Khan, as a member of the Islamic community and as a leader in the Islamic community, has a particularly pronounced obligation to do so. And to not do so is a tacit form of endorsement of the slaughter of his own people. Now, notice the way that this principle operates in the debate. We don't have to prove to you anything about the economic relationships with any country. We don't have to prove to you anything about the tensions of the rest of the world for us to win this debate. To deny the treatment of these individuals is functionally to give up the greatest moral obligation that any world leader has. That alone wins us the debate. But moreover, it also enables a greater degree of treatment towards a greater degree of better treatment towards these individuals for 2 reasons. Firstly, because the cutting of the ties puts an enormous amount of pressure on China. To cut the ties and then to directly point to those issues demonstrates to China that they do lose out economically when they do not treat the Uyghur Muslims well. Secondly, this also enables and pressures other Islamic world leaders to now further criticize China for the reason that it establishes a precedent and for the reason that once the door has been opened, further discourse can be opened for the reason that other leaders can say, well, why aren't you making the same comments? All of which would suggest to you that the treatment of Uyghur Muslims will become far better. That is the first prong on which we win the debate. I'll take a POI from opening opposition.
In this video, I'll show you how to set up and manage live stream.
India looks like on the matter of Kashmir.
On the matter of Kashmir, we think a meaningful visit to India means that you're able to open up a dialogue at all, which currently barely exists. And it also means that both sides are willing to make more concessions for the reason that they have more at stake to lose. But it also means that at the very worst case, it is likely that the two countries don't break out into war because they would be far more economically entangled, which means both countries would lose out far more at the point of war. You guys aren't going to win on Kashmir. Let's talk about why this is better for Pakistan economically. The first thing to note here is that China is a deeply predatory economic partner. China has an asymmetrical relationship with almost all of its economic partners, and you only need to look at Cambodia, you only need to look at North Korea to understand how it treats its economic partners. Firstly, that operates in the fashion in which it offers loans to other countries, particularly in the form of infrastructure loans. And Pakistan is a shining example of that. They owe billions just in commercial loans to China. They have $60 billion of infrastructure loans left to pay. And it's not just the size of the loans, it's the interest rates at which they have to pay them back. They're paying. That leads to two. Either they get some short-term benefit from these loans, but they're crippled into the future because they have to continue repaying these loans and they aren't able to develop their own structures of financing their own infrastructure. Or at some point, they won't be able to pay these loans back, just like what happened in Sri Lanka, and they'll end up having to do a debt-to-equity swap and give up a huge amount of power to China and a huge amount of land to China. The problem with that is it massively hurts China. It massively hurts Pakistan's sovereignty, and it further extends China's soft power to the point where China is now able to further destabilize the region and further pose a risk to the rest of the world. The second thing to note is that the infrastructure projects that China has been offering to Pakistan have stunted Pakistan for long-term growth for the reason that Pakistan is now unable to actually develop meaningfully its own infrastructure projects to meaningfully do the things that would mean its economy is able to skill up in such a fashion that it is able to have long-term growth. The second thing to note about why it hurts Pakistan and also economically, but also more broadly, is because China's allyship has further isolated Pakistan from the global community. People like countries like the US are increasingly suspicious of China's relationship with Pakistan. And as it goes on, the US is far less likely to ally itself from China, which means not only is Pakistan less likely to be able to opt into things like, global deals, which are more diversified, which are more strong, and which enable them openings into IGOs, it also means that in times of tension, Pakistan is isolated and likely to be decimated. Finally, let's talk about regional tension. The first thing to note is that there exists a lot of regional tension, particularly between that of India and Pakistan. This goes a long way to decrease that tension for the reasons that I say in response to a POI earlier, but for the additional reason that now Pakistan can be viewed as making concessions to India in the first place, which goes against a whole lot of the rhetoric coming out of the Modi government at the moment. And at the very least, in the eyes of the people of India, makes Pakistan a more preferable partner. But the other thing to note is that the China-Pakistan relationship makes the India-Pakistan relationship actively worse for the reason that India and the rest of the West is deeply suspicious of China and views the move towards China to be a deeply cynical one. That means that India is more likely to retaliate against Pakistan preemptively in order to stop the growing influence of China. There is a moral obligation for Pakistan to criticize China, and that is only possible when they ally with India. China has been destroying Pakistan's economy and the regional economy. They should divorce themselves from it. And the only way to solve the enormous amount of regional tension is to stop the pernicious influence of China in the region. Proud to stand at Prime Minister.
I thank very much the Prime Minister for their remarks and invite the Leader Opposition to present the opposition's position. Hear, hear.
Okay. Can everybody see me / hear me?
Yes, but before you begin, maybe we can have the timer reset. I yield the floor to you. Thank you.
Okay. All right, 4 points in my speech. First, why we think China is a better actor generally in order to get more benefits out for Pakistan. Second, why we think Pakistan has unique leverage over China in several key respects. Third, why we think that Pakistan probably isn't likely to take up the deal very well should we do this. And then fourthly, why India is not likely to take up the deal rather well and why we're going to be wasting basically a whole bunch of money. But before I do that, I'd like to get into the case that was presented to you by opening government. The first thing that they say is that we have a moral obligation as the leader of Pakistan to criticize the Chinese regime because of the Chinese treatment of Muslims. I would note that India's treatment of Muslims probably also isn't exactly stellar. I would note that they've implemented incredibly restrictive quarantine procedures against the entire, or not quarantine, but rather lockdown procedures against the entirety of Kashmir, even cutting off access to basic utilities such as cell networks, right? I would say that to the extent that Pakistan has an obligation to not go out with China in the absolute moral sense, I would say it also has an obligation to not pivot towards India in the moral sense for the same reason. To the point where you start saying, oh, well, there are different factors which influence this, because maybe Pakistan would be able to influence people more, would be able to influence China more, or maybe the degrees of the things that they're doing are different or interact with the situation differently. At the point where that becomes a factor in the principled calculus, then it becomes actually a question of a utilitarian metric in terms of what can happen as a result of this, right? So I think that doesn't work on the principled stance, but I also don't think they've illustrated why this obligation exists for world leaders to do anything about this beyond their ability to ground this in the utilitarian case. So what are you actually going to do about this? They recognize this, and then they give 2 points of analysis as to why that's likely to be the case. The first of which is that they say cutting of the ties puts a significant amount of pressure on China. Look, I don't think they can get away with one piece of analysis saying that China is going to drastically reorder its internal politics, right? Like the suppression of Uyghur Muslims is like clearly relevant to Chinese party success and the formation of a national Han Chinese identity, which allows the ruling party in power to keep its power and consolidate its power. It's totally unclear that Pakistan, a relatively small economy that, sorry, not that many people care about outside of the region in the immediate vicinity, right? In terms of like its power on the global like geopolitical sphere, is going to like cause China to actually switch. But secondly, there are other mechanisms that it's going to encourage other leaders to pivot, right? Totally unclear why. I would note again that Pakistan is relatively One Belt One Road network yet. It probably is a uniquely bad idea now that you have loans to then switch to an uncertain economic uncertain economic future by trying to ally with India to a greater extent. That seems like it would get you even farther in a trap and make it so that you are now beholden to two actors. Because note that India is going to see that you are beholden to China and probably use that to exploit you in terms of trade deals, in terms of making sure that they get an even better deal. Their last thing about was the global community, saying that it's going to isolate Pakistan from like the US and Europe. Like, when has the US or the global community ever helped Pakistan, right? Like, literally never, right? It's a huge amount of there's a high tension between these countries. The US is really not a fan of Pakistan, especially for like management of radical Islamic terrorist groups. Okay. Here's why China will give you better trade deals and like better deals in general, right? Note that China has a much larger economy than India. It has a much more developed tech sector and key resource production sector. The Chinese banks are literally the biggest in the world right now in terms of assets they have, and they're progressively expanding their capital markets to where the yuan is likely to replace the dollar in at least the next coming years. They have access to huge Asian growing markets and inroads into developing markets in Africa, and they have long-term prospects in terms of building economic partners. This means that from a purely utilitarian perspective, Pakistan benefits significantly more, gets a significant higher amount of money. This is good for a variety of reasons. And then there's also like investment, right? China has a huge amount of capital that it wants to invest in this. It has a huge amount of foreign currency reserves. It has the political will to invest in this types of things, right? India, it's unclear, has A, the money to do so, or B, the political will to especially invest in Pakistan. Why is this important? Because when you have a higher amount of economic return, A, all of those people just access better economic goods because they can get better trade deals on the global economic sphere. But secondly, it makes it more likely that the country becomes stable and that you don't have terrorist tensions or you don't have radical tensions, because we know that one of the primary causes of terrorism, of populism, is when people don't have food to eat. At the point where you make it so that people have a much higher degree of economic prosperity, it probably stabilizes the country. Why then does Pakistan still have leverage over China? Why is it unlikely? Because we know that one of the primary causes of terrorism, China explicitly wants Pakistan to be a thorn in the side of India, or rather to use it as a way that India can't grow to actually rival it, right? Because India is one of China's primary rivals just due to a population size factor alone, right? 1 billion versus 1.6 billion, right? Helping Pakistan will be a good way of weakening India. It sees it as a strategically smart investment. But secondly, note that with One Belt, One Road, China really wants to use Pakistan to access its coast, to build pipelines, and also to use it as a central hub for like imports, like all the way through the continent, right? So you want to import, you want to build pipelines, you want to get key resources that China can access, and like Pakistan is uniquely geopolitically located in order to do this. China also knows that by doing this, it could avoid sea routes and avoid Singapore, which is very often controlled by, or which is controlled by ASEAN, which has some tensions with China, particularly in South China Sea conflicts, which means China is significantly willing to invest, make concessions, make good quality loans for the type of people of Pakistan because they know that Pakistan might leave it otherwise, right? Irrespective of this, if we react well to India, there's going to create like significant breaches of trust, right? Because we want long-term investment from China. We want them to build a pipeline and then keep that pipeline. It's unlikely if they're going to invest in these massive infrastructure projects once they see we're willing to switch away. It's unclear what exactly their plan looks like, but it probably will at least involve clear signaling mechanisms of moving towards India militarily, economically, these kind of things. Finally, we think it's unlikely that this is going to happen in Pakistan, and Samuel will develop this more as well. Note that there's a high amount of radical Islamists and nationalists that have a strong presence in Pakistani institutions and political parties, right? We know it's so bad that sometimes the Pakistani government has reasonable troubles controlling their military situation and managing terrorists, right? So we know then that especially allying with one of the historic oppressors of their Muslim community, and this is like a very high media thing, right? That's probably going to inflame them and make them go even more tactics, right? Or make them go to even greater extents in terms of actually gaining power in the country. Finally, the last point is that it's really unlikely that India is actually going to come closer to you, but for these reasons, we think that you should oppose.
And just before the DPM speech starts, can we check?
Did a minute of my speech cut out?
No, we heard all of it.
Okay.
Can somebody just confirm from the OC if the timer situation is sorted?
Yeah. Actually, there was an internet issue. We've sorted it, so we have someone else timing it. Apologies for that. It'll not be an issue from now on.
Cool.
Okay. I thank the Leader Opposition and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to close out the opening government case. Here.
This is not necessarily a debate about what is better for Pakistan, though that speech seemed to think it was. This is a debate about what is best for the world. What is the most likely chance to take a stance against the oppression of Uyghur Muslims in China? What is most likely to improve the world by lessening the soft power of an autocratic state like China? Unfortunately, most of that 7 minutes was wasted. First, with respect to Uyghurs, we get pitiful response here. The first thing they say is the Indian treatment is also bad. First, we give you structural reasons in Ollie's speech why it is easier to reform and substantially likely to become better under our side. No response to that material. Second, we tell you it's a matter of scale. Yes, there's forced detention of people in Kashmir who are Islamic. There is not organ harvesting like there is in Xinjiang. So to somehow suggest that that means that there is an arbitrary principal metric with respect to distinction is ludicrous. That is not like by that basis, there would be no justification to enter into Rwanda because it's not meaningfully different from the racial oppression of other groups where they're oppressed to a lesser extent. At some point, we need to say that enough is enough. We then say that we got change with respect to that in three core ways, but that didn't matter. We'd already won on that basis alone. We told you first that it opened the door to more active criticism because when Imran Khan, it no longer feels as if he is afraid of retaliation economically, he can more easily call attention to these issues like he already has. That leads to a furor and firestorm with respect to Islamic media, which is also likely to put pressure on China. Second, it sets a precedent to China by saying that countries will move away if that human rights doesn't improve. This team's response is to say, oh, it's a small economy. Well, firstly, your third point literally says that they care a great deal about China, about Pakistani interaction. You contradict yourself when you say, oh, there's 4 reasons why it's extremely likely that they care about like Pakistani power and being a thorn in India's side and ASEAN and trade interactions. That means that there is likely to be substantial pressure on them to reform. You've shot yourself in the foot. But the second thing to say, it's not a small a country. What are you talking about? It's $280 billion a year in GDP. The third thing we say is that it puts pressure on other Islamic leaders via contrast, because when an Islamic leader in another country is actively calling it out, it puts pressure on other countries like Jordan and Egypt and Iran to also have their leaders formally rebuke that state, to also have them push away with respect to trade, particularly when Imran Khan is also criticizing them for not calling out those oppressions. Those mechanisms were there. It's the most important issue in the debate, because even if this lessened the oppression of those millions of people who face the worst sort of treatment in the world, that was better than some minor economic harm with respect to Pakistan. So that is like it is not fair for LO not to properly engage with the biggest impact in the debate and then somehow respond to it at DLO. Let's then pivot to the economy, though based on impacting this is less important. The first thing they say is that they have leverage over them because they're a thorn in India's side. This is actually useful material for us. They are silly. That is for two reasons. First of all, it shows that that losing them is significant, which means that they are very likely to want to actively try and reform their policies and are likely to take it as an act of condemnation and signal that what they're doing is wrong. But second, it gives them leverage with India, because when you have an extremely strong partnership with another state and that is not in India's interests, for the reasons they give you, that they're a thorn in India's side, like, my God, what a contradiction. That makes India want to have a successful trade relationship with them. It makes India want to come to the table and properly engage with them. Then with respect to loans, they just suggest that the series of facts we give you are just an assertion. No, read a book. It's also consistent with the way in which China acts economically. Look at Chad, look at Kenya, look at the extremely predatory loans that exist there. And for them to say, well, why would you take the loans is just an empirically silly question, because often leaders are clouded by short-term interests in order to get that economy going in the first place. The second thing they say is that you're plugged into the network of the Belt and Road, but note that means that now is the only time you can properly leave before you were too properly ensconced. And at that point, China can give you worse trade deals and worse trade going forward because you were so heavily ensconced in that trade network. Second, our model was just to say that you had a slow withdrawal. It didn't mean that was necessarily harmful. The third thing they say is that India exploits you, but all of their analysis is that India wants you to come to the table. They don't want you to be allied with their biggest foe in that region. They shot themselves in the foot. The fourth thing they say is that the US hasn't helped them. Well, no shit. That's because they're allied with China, guys. The reason that they can now more closely integrate with the United States is firstly because they're integrating with India, who has strategic military and trade alliances with them, but also because now they've made a powerful symbolic movement away from their geopolitical foe. So yes, maybe things aren't great with the US at the moment, but they can't become substantially better. Engage with the analysis. Then they just say a series of reasons why China is a pretty good economy. For a team that accuses us of being assertive, this is also pretty assertive. But note that this is based on the presumption that there is a form of equal partnership here, which there is not. The next thing they say is that the country's become stable, but that is also predicated on them proving that there is a substantial better economic benefit. What did we tell you? To little response. We tell you that these are bad investments, that they have 7% interest, that just like we saw in Sri Lanka, they bake in debt to equity swaps, which means that Pakistani businesses don't even have control over what they are doing anymore, and you lose control over those businesses. We also tell you that there's alternative forms of funding. If you need funding, go to the IMF like they did last year for $6 billion. The idea that this is the only option is silly. Third, we tell you that the Indian economy is preferable because of a series of reasons. It's similarly large, it's now industrialized, geographically it's proximate, which reduces costs with respect to imports and exports and travel levies, etc. And all of those things mean that you are better integrated with respect to that. No response, DLO is too late. Finally, we tell you that it isolates other international actors to little response. I'll take a POI from closing opposition if you have one. Too late, OO.
What is more likely for China to change on a policy basis? The conditions of loans it grants, or how it treats its interior minorities in order to make sure that the Han China Party...
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, it's more likely to change its internal relations. And the reasons for that are all of the reasons we already gave you. It's the fact that you can still subjugate Xinjiang and still treat them poorly, or still give them some degree of autonomy and get them out of the mainland without compromising your massive economic sector. But notice as well that the economic success of China and the narrative of China is integral to their internal control. So when your allies leave you, when your control leaves you, you also weaken your own domestic control as well. Finally, we told you this ended Indian tensions, to no response except an assertion at 7 minutes that that other people would be mad. We tell you 5 reasons. First, we tell you that the very motion implies active diplomatic convergence, peace talks, just like we saw with the Simla Agreement in 1974. We tell you that you get increased economic integration, which leads to more peace in 2 ways, because more people actually know each other, and because you're hurting your own business when you use paratroopers to attack that other state. We tell you there's symbolism from turning away from China, which Ollie tells you to no response. We tell you that it is now in both parties' interests to minimize that conflict, and they will work more readily to do so, and that there is now active forgiveness for things like historical attacks. That meant that you got a decline in one of the longest running conflicts in the world. Fewer people died, fewer casualties, Kashmir got better. Extremely proud to propose this motion.
I think the
30
deputy.
seconds. Please give me 30 seconds. I need to switch my Wi-Fi network for ensuring stability.
Yeah, of course. Just start when you're ready. Thanks.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are. Can we wait 5 seconds? I think Yash is still not back. He's switching his Wi-Fi.
I'm back. We can start.
Okay, cool.
Okay, great. In that case, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Okay, let's be very clear about what we're defending on OO in this debate. So obviously, as this House believes debate, we're not debating this specifically from the perspective of Pakistan. What we're telling you is that this pivot is unlikely to result in a long-term strengthening of the relationship between Pakistan and India. Therefore, most of the benefits that Gov is trying to claim there will not accrue, and I'll go into that in a moment. We're furthermore saying that the current relationship between Pakistan and China is actually genuinely mutually beneficial and is unlikely to be resolved, helps both countries. And we're lastly claiming that this move by Imran Khan will empower radical Islamist factions within Pakistan that then pose a significant risk to further escalation within the Pakistani-Indian conflict. Okay, cool. First, some rebuttal on opening government. Like, their whole case about Uyghur Muslims is incredibly bizarre and weird. First of all, let's be very clear. They both claim that Pakistan is currently like a victim of Chinese debt trap diplomacy and like heavily indebted to China, but also claim that a pivot away from China would mean that Pakistan suffers has no economic ties to China and therefore was able to freely criticize it. Like, this is already obviously a contradiction. If they are indebted in a lot of loan projects, they don't have the kind of economic freedom to make this criticism in the first place. Secondly, though, the causal mechanism between one leader of one Islamic country criticizing China and anything happening is incredibly strenuous. Note, like, the entire Western world has criticized China heavily and punished it both diplomatically and economically over its treatment of Uyghur Muslims for like over a year, and this hasn't changed China's internal policy in the slightest. So it is very unclear how, by this logic, the move of Pakistan would change anything about China's own internal motivations. We say that China has very strong like national reasons for oppressing Uyghur Muslims. You don't just like change that by fucking criticizing someone as a world leader. Like, criticism hasn't done anything ever. It is incredibly bizarre how this is supposed to work. Note that also, like, you need to think about why no other big like Muslim country is openly criticizing China. This is because China has massive economic leverage. Like, Saudi Arabia will keep not criticizing China, even though it has a massive religious and ideological incentives to protect Muslims all over the world. So if they don't do this, it's very unclear why Pakistan, of all countries, could be capable of this. So this just falls out of the debate and out of plausibility. Okay. One point on this idea that the US will now be a strong ally of Pakistan. The reason why the US isn't close with Pakistan is unrelated to Chinese relations. It is because Pakistan shielded the Taliban, and the Taliban are like a major enemy of the US, and one of the reasons why they invaded the Middle East. We think like this historical relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban is the reason why the US hates them and why it will also not associate with them in the future. Okay, cool. So let's be clear on why the relationship between Pakistan and India is unlikely to get better. Let's first look at this from the Indian perspective. We don't think that India well to this pivot, because currently, like, this means the currently reigning Modi government would have to actively take steps to diffuse the situation with Pakistan, make peace talks, also make concessions. We think this is unlikely for a number of reasons. Because like Modi bases his power on a heavy nationalist and Hindu nationalist base of supporters that like have very high resentments both against Muslims writ large and against Pakistan for historical reasons and religious reasons. So Modi cannot allow himself to publicly suck up to Pakistan and to become more friendly with them, because this sacrifices his own power base and this threatens his capacity to win re-election. But we think that secondly, even if India were to respond positively, ultimately because of lingering resentments against Muslims, note how India is okay, look, I'm not an expert of India, but everything Indian debaters have told me so far is that the Modi government is treating Muslims pretty shit all over the country. And so I think if they're already doing this to their own Muslims, it's not like they're going to be very happy and friendly towards Pakistan and want to invest a lot of money into that country or improve its economic relations. And at the very least, China doesn't have that same kind of resentment on a religious and historic level, even if by some weird idea they were predatory. Okay, so now let's see what this does from a Pakistani perspective. What we think is a reasonable assumption is that Pakistan has a very strong presence of radical Islamist forces that have entrenched themselves both culturally, religiously, and institutionally into the country, and have a strong presence within the politics and the religious community of Pakistan as a country, since both India and Pakistan have continuously entrenched themselves deeper in a mutual ideology of hatred of the other country and reinforced beliefs that strengthen this. So radical Islamist forces that rail against India have been strengthened over time within Pakistan quite strongly. I'll take one from CG now.
So we think your point on US incentives is completely backwards. It's precisely because they're scared of the Taliban that they want to ally with Pakistan and get the benefits of intelligence sharing and working together to combat those groups. Why is that not an incentive that would push them closer to Pakistan absent the threat of China?
Okay, look, we think the US doesn't like Pakistan because it consistently shields the Taliban, and the Taliban in many ways are directly entrenched into different state and military structures of Pakistan itself. We don't think the US likes that, but the US also isn't a big part of the debate. So what we think will happen if Imran Khan does this is two things. A, the general conservative voters and people that are religious in Pakistan, which is a lot of people, will not like this move because they've been trained for years to not like India and see them as their enemy. And a lot of religious leaders and conservative political figures in Pakistan will rail against this. This means that on average, they're more likely to elect more radical and more conservative leaders into power that then will become even more strongly opposed towards India. But secondly, we think radical terrorists that currently reside within Pakistan have been shielded from law enforcement and from actual clampdown for a long time because Pakistan benefited from terrorism happening in India. But now they are threatened by a peace process because the concessions that Pakistan would presumably have to make is actually clamp down on the Taliban and punish them. We think the Taliban want to prevent this, and they want to prevent this by committing more terrorist attacks that in India that then force India to become more anti-Pakistan to jeopardize the whole peace process. We think ultimately the countries won't move closer together. You only empower radical Islamists within Pakistan. You give more incentives for terrorist attacks to happen, and ultimately violence and escalation is more likely. I think that's awful. Please oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader Opposition for their remarks. Invite the member government to present the closed government's case. And can we get the timer reset, please?
I just want to make sure that I'm audible and y'all can hear me well.
You are, thank you. Maybe we can get the timer fixed though before you take the floor.
Yep.
Thank
you.
Is somebody from the Occam around?
Okay, cool.
Thanks. I yield the floor to the member speaker.
Panel, there's been something very interesting happening across top half, right? Basically, OG and OO both concede that Pakistan either has leverage or doesn't have leverage, but then selectively use it to debate whether it's going to be better for them on the economic front or whether it's going to be better for them geopolitically, right? We get very little optical analysis on what Pakistan's incentives actually are, how India's incentives actually are, and forget about Kashmir, right? There are more issues that India fundamentally cares about in like terms of relations with Pakistan, and also how it affects the rest of the world, that we have to analyze what teams in the top half are necessarily missing. What closing government gives you is a unique stance. We think that economically, you're opening up alternatives, something that OG is completely missed in this debate, which is a fundamental reason Pakistan wants to make this pivot. Also, when you make this economic pivot, you also get with numerous optical benefits that just can't be achieved through China. But first, let's address something like on like this principal quibble that's going on in the top half, right? It's relatively unresolved, and this is what CG has to say on this, right? At the point that the US has way more leverage over China than being like a major trade partner, or regardless of whoever you believe on who has leverage, we think the US making strong veiled statements at the Uyghur Muslims has accomplished absolutely no change, right? We don't really think this is something that's going to move the debate in either direction. Not super sure on how to weigh this. We're going to say it doesn't matter that much. Secondly, on economics, we get sort of a very underdeveloped economic stance from OG. It's not just about China being a terrible economic partner, but what they actually gain from the pivot, right? It's the response you get from China and the even better response you get from Western actors when Pakistan signals to the rest of the world they're going to be pivoting to India. Why? The fundamental reason is that you are basically closing off Pakistan's options right now where they have no alternatives. OG just says, India is a good trading partner because they're industrialized. And then China's like, OO is like, China's an even better partner. We don't get any sort of comparative analysis on why any country would want to do this. So let CG be the first team that actually analyzes what are India's incentives in order to accept this pivot. First, we think that reduces chances of like the Kashmiri conflict blowing up in terms of the international optics. Why is this so problematic? Because we see there's currently no solvency in the problem. Like Russia already supports India, but isn't making any fundamental action. China has no position, maybe just like India. That's because of their own border conflicts. The US is closer with India, but wants to not really get militarily involved in the Middle East and further, and is not making any sort of concerted statement, right? We also see there's no domestic like propulsion for solving the issue because of the exact reasons that OO gave you about like nationalist fundamentalists who just won't let the issue concede. Therefore, if Kashmir is a wash, then what are India's other incentives in terms of why they want a pivot? First, they have geopolitical aspirations that are fundamentally spaced against China's. Understand that the reason China makes like expansive Belt and Road Initiative with like collateral as land is because it can attack other regional actors who are strong and pose geopolitical threats. For example, why capitalizing on the Sri Lankan port is extremely important is because it's right on the southern border of India, right? Why capturing ports in Vietnam and like expanding infrastructure there is because they have spheres of influence basically constricting India. This is a geopolitical theory known as the string of pearls that Modi has actively tried to work against in the last 3 years, right? If the only option Modi has to counteract and make India a stronger geopolitical actor is sort of accept this pivot, then the only incentive that exists on India is to accept. So we think at the point that India is only going to be forced into or be seeing more benefit because of accepting this, but also getting more economic advantages from Pakistan's point of view. What does OO say on this? They provide the correct economic response and just say like Chinese projects are like probably not like well thought out in the future. We also think they ignore the fact that there's no capital offerings in the status quo. What does CG bring to you on this? We think that alternate sources of investment are completely cut out in the status quo. Why do they happen? Because one, means the incentive for the West to gain a stake against China is really important. People want allies in the area. See the bond that Trump has actively tried to establish with Modi. Second, we think that intelligence sharing capabilities of Pakistan are a unique asset, right? We get sort of like this analysis from other countries being like, oh, we don't want, like the US doesn't want to engage with the Pakistan because they hate the Taliban. That's just fundamentally untrue, right? Trump cut off relations in 2017 because he's very anti-globalist and likes to paint this nationalist narrative of, hey, we don't like Pakistan.
I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. Please stop. Please stop. One of the judges has disconnected. Please stop right there. We can maybe pause the timer. Bansal Karthik is saying he has some issues. Can we just confirm if he's around? Okay, I don't think he is.
Okay, am I audible again?
Yeah, you're audible.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. I think the internet crashed somewhere.
I just know where I cut out for you,
hello?
so I can go back to that point.
Anti-globalism.
Yeah, so the last I heard, Nitin, was on the geopolitical interests regarding the port in Sri Lanka. Yeah, I am so sorry. Like, I tried informing us.
So, OC, start the timer when Nitin reaches the anti-globalization argument. Until then, Nitin, probably you can repeat that part that Bansal missed.
I think we should start the timer based on the amount of time that elapses. So if we could have a countdown for a minute and a half, however long, and then come back to this timer.
Yeah, don't start this timer, but...
Okay. So the reason the Sri Lankan port is so important in this debate is not because it poses like some sort of advantage for China economically, but it's because it poses another geopolitical attack against India. Why is it so important, right? Like that port is positioned right on the southern border of India. We see that China has also tried to expand this to Vietnam and Cambodia in the Southeast Asia because it borders India on the east. This is a geopolitical theory known as like the string of pearls that Modi has actively tried to combat against in the last 3 years. Why do we think this is so important? Because if India has geopolitical aspirations in Asia to not only be subservient to China, but also to like overtake them, they have to analyze incentives other than just Kashmir. If we agree that there's a gridlock on Kashmir and no solvency is going to be made, India only faces possible advantages from accepting this pivot. But next, let's move on to economics, because when OO provide the correct economic response in terms of Chinese projects, they ignore the fact there is no current capital offering. They prove that Pakistan has unique leverage that makes China want to listen, right? But you can just flip their entire argument, because if Pakistan has a sort of unique leverage that appeals to China, it also appeals to the West, which means you can extract good deals from both sides. Let's look at the alternative investments that just OG ignores. Why do they happen? We think there's an incentive for the West to gain a stake against China in the status quo. They want allies in the area. See the Trump-Modi bond, for example, right? But also, Pakistan has unique intelligence sharing capabilities that are a unique asset. Understand that, for example, Trump, right, like cut off aid in 2017 only because he was an anti-globalist who wants to paint Pakistan as a bad actor. Until then, the Obama administration, even the Bush administration, heavily cooperated with Pakistan in order to gain this intelligence sharing capabilities and understand what Pakistan was doing. Even if they're an active state sponsor of terrorism, they still provide valuable insights that could help the US and the rest of the West in the fight against terrorism. Also, the profit motive exists in the exact same way that it does for China, right? The IMF has a deep relationship with Pakistan already in the status quo, and at the point that we see private FDI just flee when they have to compete against China's ultra-low rates, Pakistan is lost with leverage. They have no alternative forms of investment, and pivoting to India is the only way they can get them back. What are the impacts here? You're only getting Pakistani jobs, not Chinese jobs that are like self-extracting and predatory. They're self-fulfilling, not self-extracting. You are helping the populations that are massively undercut from China in the status quo. But also understand what this does in terms of optics, right? We think the unique mechanisms of intelligence sharing also go over to the like overall geopolitical scale. We think that in the UN, when you pass sanctions against like state sponsors of terrorism or like very China-focused like US against groups, you also convince on-the-fence countries or like fringe states that don't really care about like which sides, but just want to side with the Western alliance, right? So countries like Spain or the larger US NATO influence is going to side better with Pakistan. That is the hard impact of optics and what CG can bring you. It's not just about opening up alternative forms of investment that are going to prosper for Pakistan, but also making sure they're a legitimate actor in the global scale. Proud to propose.
Can I just get 10 seconds? I think I need to switch my internet connection as well.
Yeah.
Am I audible? Hello?
Yeah.
Cool. Just give me 10 seconds, and after Vishaka comes back, I'll start my speech.
Okay, I'm good on my end.
Okay, just give me 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm ready. Ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the words of the motion. This House believes Pakistan should pivot away from China. OO has done a great job of saying why they should stay with China. but they haven't told you why moving towards India is a problem, and that is a larger contribution that we want to give in this debate. We need to prove that it's worse for China to move towards India than stay with China, or it's okay if they do whatever they want with China. Moving towards India is the bad pivot, and that is the focus of this debate. The entire Gov bench have been sitting on the premise that they're going to get very lucrative deals from India. We'll be the first ones to show you why the Indian economy cannot afford any lucrative deals, and there exists no political incentive for this. Before that, let's deal with OG. They say that Imran Khan owes an obligation to other Muslims. We think Imran Khan is in a unique position to help the people in Pakistan who have given him his mandate, and he has a larger obligation to look after their best interests, right? We don't think that he owes a larger obligation to other Muslims, because there are many other actors who can fulfill that obligation. There are many other Muslim nations that can call out China and open the door for that criticism. Insofar as that is a principle, we're not sure whether they're fulfilling that principle in terms of getting any change by tweeting. We don't think that's a large part of this debate, right? This doesn't also consider the fact that the Indian government is also part of Muslim oppression, right? Look, Muslims are being oppressed in India. Like, there's Hindu nationalism on the rise, there's a CAA bill, there's lynchings, there's beatings. Modi doesn't call out any of it. Northeast Delhi had Muslim houses being broken down. COVID-19 has brought a new level of communalism that is about this. Protests are being clamped down. It's very concerning that India is so comparable to China today, and Daniel can give you 5 more examples of how this is not being fulfilled, all which were missing from OO. They just said that they've heard from their debating friends. These are just better examples. Okay, moving to what CG brings us, right? CG says India has aspirations against China, right? We don't think that's true. India is largely apolitical in that it is not really been very, very buddy-buddy with the West or with China. They have some deals with China. India's largest trading partner is China, and they have been making these deals. Insofar as they are making deals with other Eastern nations, like the Look East sort of movement that Modi is doing, we don't think that's mutually important. That's not being done exclusively to combat China or China's influence. But we do consider its border tension with China and things, and it's not completely in the interest. We don't think India's aspirations against China are large enough for them to give Pakistan very lucrative deals, because the cost benefit analysis for the Modi government is simply clear. No amount of economic good can justify giving concessions to Pak, given the base that we have here, right? We think them again, their entire argument is contingent on the premise they'll get good deals and the West will support you. We don't think that's going to happen, and after we get more analysis, probably it's going to rebut them. Next, the idea of Pakistan intelligence sharing. We think this will have to come at the cost of them conceding that they're harboring terrorism, which won't happen. And even if that happens, it's probably not in their interest, because the Indian government is going to be a right moment, and the rest of the world will probably be sanctioning Pak for that. We don't think it's strategic for them to do this, and we don't think they're ever going to do this, right? We don't think this is part of the pivot, and we think there's been a lack of characterization of what this pivot looks like, what kind of trade is it going to have, what kind of deals are going to be signed. They're just saying that Pakistan will come and negotiate about Kashmir, and we think this is irrelevant, as CG concedes that this negotiating table they've reached there so many times. Nothing has happened. It's a land issue that has now become an identity issue that's never going away, right? We think that's not a part of this debate. The larger part of this debate that we'd like to extend on is about why India is a very poor economic actor that can do nothing to help Pakistan, right? Here is analysis. Let's analyze the Indian economy and tell you what the incentives of the Indian government are, right? In terms of rural incomes, there's been deflationary pressure put in by the fact that agricultural support prices were low in order to keep urban inflation down, which has resulted in rural distress. There's no money in the hands of these people, and they can't spend money. There's far worse for the economy. Our agrarian economy is in ruins. There's no consolidation of land. There's still like zamindars in these rural areas. Farmers are committing suicide. There is no good economy thing that's going on over here for there to be any trade, right? Second, in terms of private investment, to tackle the downfall of investment, the government has reduced corporate taxes. This is ineffective because the problem is a demand problem. India's top people have huge amount of cash reserves. Lack of money isn't the problem. The problem is there is no demand. Why borrow to increase capacity when there's no demand? Corporate taxes have been completely inefficient. There is no structural change happening here as well. There's no investment going on. There's nothing to trade. Thirdly, in terms of the Indian Industrial Disputes Act, India requires firms with 100 or more workers to seek government permissions to retrench or lay off any worker. There's all sorts of regulation that is not very, very compatible with free market or profit-making incentives that is hampering India. In terms of land acquisition, people are not being given rehabilitation about people who are displaced. There's a lot of exacerbated unemployment happening here due to this. In terms of growing uncertainty among investors, we think this is increasing because the Indian government has been very sporadic about how they treat this investment. After Walmart invested by buying Flipkart for $16 billion, the government was lobbied by competitors to immediately change e-commerce laws that negatively affected Walmart. Such instances create a huge sense of uncertainty and distrust among investors to even come to India. There's been things like demonetization that happened, right? India's economy is not growing that much. In terms of the banking sector as well, this due to non-performing assets of the state bank ballooning to the amount of $200 billion, the government decided to cut credit flow to small and medium businesses. The problem with this is that borrowing doesn't stop. Rather, these businesses look for alternatives, non-banking financial corporations that are exploitative of their vulnerability. These guys are being exploited. They're not really making a lot of money. All of these things are unlikely to change because it's not a part of electoral discourse. Issues like religion, caste are within the government mandate about what happens in electoral discourse, right? Nobody even addresses the problems within the Indian economy. We think that this is why these things are not going to change. The Indian economy is continuing to be in the slump, given that we don't see the Modi government going away, right? We think the Indian economy is not sustainable with itself. And this is important because these guys Gov has to characterize to us what this pivot looks like, what is going to be traded, what are the benefits that are going to be accrued, none of which has been unproven. And now that we've been honest, there's nothing to trade with, there's no pivot that is possible. It's entirely clear that we are winning this debate, given the fact that because of the COVID crisis that has crippled everybody's economy, and Indian government has done nothing to, or even the Pakistani government has done nothing to offset this, we think is more problematic. We think this is especially important given its government's burden to prove how this pivot works. We think this characterization, we think coming to the real case, right? We think the parts of electoral discourse that happens about Pakistan is uncooperative, and the political incentive is to be harsh on Pakistan due to our history. That is to say, the only good deal Modi can strike with Pakistan is one that is exploitative, one that will be something that like a data where they can do a sovereignty breach and grab some land or assets for the Akhand Bharat vision that they have. At the end of the debate, we have proven why India specifically is a bad ally for Pakistan. They may or may not have a better chance with China. And we think America is not going to play well with Pakistan. America is not going to play well with NATO. He's a major player in NATO, and we don't think America is going to necessarily come and bail out Pakistan. We think the Indian government is not a good ally, and we are not sure what this debt trap is going to look like now with China. Is India going to help them pay off the debt or what? Like, it's very unclear. We think that China is going to react to this very badly if there's an existing pivot. This can lead to things like seizure of assets and seizure of land within Pakistan. And we think they're better off staying there, or they may reevaluate the relation they have with China. It's entirely clear that Indian economy has nothing to offer for these people. And we think Imran Khan has an obligation to make sure that the people in his base are appeased. And that's why we don't think that he should do this. And that obligation comes from the democratic principle that these people need to be represented at the national level, and we think Imran Khan has to justify that to his people, and that's a larger moral good that we are proving. At the end of this debate, we have proven why India is the bad actor, and maybe they have a better shot with China. As the only Indian team in this final, it's my honor to propose Bharat Mata Ki Jai.
I thank the member opposition for their remarks. Invite the government whip to close out the closing government case. Here.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. Just give me 1 second and I'll start. Honorable panel, a pivot by Pakistan towards India and away from China is good if India is receptive to it. But more importantly, it's good even if India is not. That's what I'm going to prove to you in my whip speech today. I want to talk about 3 things in the speech: how India is likely to respond, why the incentive structures that come out from Nitin's speech are the best and most accurate characterization of what India's incentives are, respond to kind of the weak CO response we get to that characterization. Secondly, I want to talk about the most important and most contested point in the round regarding how economies change and regarding how economic development is comparatively different on both sides of the house. Thirdly, I want to talk about diplomatic outcomes. And most importantly, I want to weigh why the incentive structures we give you prove that the economic point is more important than the diplomatic point, but also that CG is the team that best answers the diplomatic question. Cool. As to how India responds, I think what you get from top half of this debate is a series of assertions both ways that are possibly true, right? That OG tells you India benefits from dialogue, it challenges the rhetoric of the Modi regime, that these are good things for Pakistan to desire. And the LO tells you, look, India just hates Pakistan, right? That's what their fan base is. They're all these radical people who are just so motivated against it. We think that this is a too simplified view of Indian incentives, that they are multifaceted. We tell you that yes, it is true there's a conflict with Pakistan that is an incentive. However, Nitin gives you plenty of analysis as to why the large international players that could make a material difference one way or the other in Pakistan, namely Russia, China, the US, and like the US's allies and NATO, are all uninvolved or out of this conflict. Insofar as that is the case, the incentive for India on Kashmir, precisely because of the OO analysis about how passionate, historic, and fundamental this conflict is not to solve the Kashmir conflict, but rather to minimize the scope of violence while not making concessions. We think that is fine. The 2 other incentives then that are actually likely to matter in this debate are the geopolitical opposition to China and the international stigmatization of India as a malicious or violent actor. What are these 2 incentives? The response we get from CO is India doesn't have a problem with China. That's blatantly false. We tell you, look to the border disputes in the northeast of India stemming from the Sino-Chinese war. Look at the opposition to the Chinese ports in Sri Lanka that Modi issued himself. Look at all the arguments that it gives you about the fear of being boxed in by the string of pearls that China is building around India. These are direct harms to the geopolitical clout of India as the power of South Asia that it wants to be, that the Modi government lauds it as in his own media. That incentive remains at the point where you can negotiate with Pakistan without making concessions to Pakistan. What do I mean by this? I think what a successful Indian response looks like on our side of the house is things like diplomatic meetings that, even if they have no pragmatic use whatsoever, optically signal that India is a strong actor in the area. They signal to the rest of the world that India is willing to negotiate, that is not some hardline state that we should ignore, right? That matters for other trade partners of India. That is the international stigma. It looks like things that are trade deals that are made. They're not concessions, because a trade deal isn't losing something. It benefits both countries, that you can make that without conceding to Pakistan. It looks like non-negotiation solving Kashmir or Xinjiang. That's what we think is missing from OG. That's what we think are the two dominant incentives. The weighing comes out when the latter incentives matter more for how India is going to respond to this pivot from Pakistan. On to how economies change given this framework. What do you get from all the teams in the round? OG, I think, gives you a very good case as to why Chinese investment is not particularly great, right? OG tells you they're bad loans, that they use Chinese labor, the debt is predatory, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that is uncomparative the challenge that comes from LO, which is that the comparative is no aid. Why does the pivot to India result in trade deals? We give you these reasons. We tell you that the West is likely to fill the void and India is likely to fill the void from their own responses. Importantly, this co-opts all the benefits OG tells you about as to why India is a good economy to trade with, that they are growing, industrializing, etc. Because we tell you why you get India and you get the West in the first place. What are these reasons? Nitin gives you 5 mechanisms: the regional allies, the location, the intelligence sharing capacities, the UN sanction committees, and private investment that is not deterred. Here are the ways you impact this point. Firstly, it is just good on face that there are better economic investment in Pakistan for the economy of Pakistan. But more importantly, that competition of loans is what gives Pakistan leverage over China. By now saying, hey, I have a different actor I can turn to with loans, and the US can now be that actor because Pakistan isn't focused on China, it forces Chinese loans to become more competitive in terms of the labor standards they employ, in terms of the interest rates they offer that are so exploitative that OG wants. So our argument is how you get the solvency for the loans and give Pakistan the leverage that both top half teams think are so important. This also responds to the OO argument, because we say they are like assertive about leverage, but it is conveniently benefiting them to say it is strong versus weak. We say the reason Pakistan doesn't have leverage is because it's constrained by its alternatives by not choosing to engage with other actors besides China. The pivot toward India allows them to do all of these things. We get no response to this coming to you from closing opposition. They simply tell you, oh, trading with India is a bad idea. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But note that this argument is completely independent of whether a single trade deal gets made with India or not. Even if it is the case that you still take every single trade deal with China, the fact that you have competition to these makes those loans better. That is a material good. I'll take OO before impacting this.
Okay. We have proven to you how Pakistani terrorist groups have massive incentives to torpedoize any possible peace process through increased terror attacks, thereby alienating India and the West, creating simply more tension and escalation.
Right, like that came out at 7 minutes of your speech, and I think it's a point that's a wash on both sides, that any action by Pakistan is likely to be sabotage towards India. I don't think that really matters. Cool. On the weighing on this economic argument, though, here's why it's primal in this round. Firstly, we tell you it is more urgent than any of the other impacts, right? I think note that the characterization that gets dropped in this round of the urgency and the despondency of Pakistan's current economy. You have people on the ground suffering who cannot buy food. These better loans and things mean they can do that. We think this is the largest group of actors affected, and particularly given what I'm going to tell you about Xinjiang and Kashmir, the group that is most impacted. Let's quickly talk about CO on here. CO gives you like 4 or 5 reasons why Indian economy is bad. They say it's agrarian, it's unequal, it's regulated, it's slowing. Understand the comparative is literally China, where if you want to talk about regulations that make you not a free market, I cannot think of a less free market economy in the world to trade with than China. Every single criticism they give you of the Indian economy is mutual to the Chinese economy. So I don't really see what the harm is. We think in the worst case, you're trading with the 5th largest economy in the world. Even if it's slowing, that's fine. But more importantly, our arguments are not contingent on you trading with India. That is to say, you get all the benefits of a better economic deal. Whether or not you trade with India, you don't have to do it. We think that doesn't matter. The last thing I want to do is some weighing against OG regarding their principled arguments surrounding changes in Xinjiang. I think the problem we get with Xinjiang is twofold. Firstly, as is correctly pointed out by the opening opposition team, that there's no good analysis given from the OG team as to why the leverage of a state like Pakistan is going to be greater than the leverage of states like the US and the entire EU and the UN, who already criticize China, and where they've made no material difference in changing that. They also tell you that even if that's true, then that means the changes are likely to be significantly minor. So this principle of criticism doesn't really hold. More importantly, the principle of criticism doesn't hold at the point where India is symmetric in its poor treatment of Muslims. That means we must fall back to pragmatic outcomes. The pragmatic outcomes that we win in this round are the improvement of Pakistan's economy through alternatives. The last thing to say is we think that last thing CO tells you in like 10 seconds about the democratic principle holds true in our economic argument, because you're fulfilling the democratic principle by improving the economic and material well-being of your citizens. We think that is an adequate principle justification. The clash that matters in this round is the economy of Pakistan, how it is improved by pivoting away from China and pivoting towards India, whether or not India responds well. We are so happy to propose.
I thank the government whip for their remarks, by the opposition whip to close out the opposition bench and the debate proper. Here, here.
Can the timer be reset, please?
Yeah.
Hi, am I audible to everyone? Cool. Just give me 10-15 seconds. I'm just arranging my sheets. Thank you. We think side government loses in this debate. The point at which they tell you that it's okay even if India doesn't provide you any benefits or not, right? We think they necessarily have to show you that by pivoting towards India, you're necessarily going to help the Pakistani citizens, because as a principle for Imran Khan, his duty is towards his citizens. When people vote you in, your duty is not towards a religion, rather it's towards those people who placed you in the position of power to ensure that they get a better life, right? Which is why OG lose out in and of itself. Let me deal with OG first and take them out of the debate. The comment tell you that Pakistan can now criticize China in a much better way, except they don't tell you why this is important. Given that China has continuously vetoed any sort of allegation against them with regards to the Uyghurs, etc., within the UNSC, within other bodies of the UN, etc., we don't think that any change is happening, right? They always go and tell that, look, these are re-education camps, don't involve yourself in it, right? Secondly, with regards to the idea that Imran Khan has a principal obligation to Muslims in China, understand he himself is fucking over Ahmadiyyas within Pakistan in and of itself, right? I think at that point of time, even if there exists some sort of leverage to call out China, there is no moral high ground that Imran Khan can ever have, because he's screwing over Muslims within his own country, right? Secondly, with regards to India being nice to Muslims, if you're telling it's not going to support China because they're bad to Muslims, India themselves are also very bad to Muslims. You block out any sort of dissent. Muslims are being lynched on the streets. There's a lot of vigilantism happening. No checks on these people whatsoever. You have to bloody in Northeast Delhi, you have to place a saffron flag outside your house and erase your identity just to be protected from the sort of Hindu nationalism that is there within the country right now. We don't think that stands within this debate. Next, they come and tell you, look, China's data already exists, right? Except they don't tell you how you're going to pivot away. How are you still not going to be bound by China? No arguments coming out from either houses, OG or CG, right? Next, with regards to the idea that, look, they come and assume that India will somehow give you good incentives. Understand the sort of narrative that exists with India. The point at which you went ahead and had the Balakot strikes, what India did immediately was remove the special status from Pakistan. What they did immediately was apply extremely harsh sanctions on them, because that is what the citizens wanted. Modi is always under the constant threat of being nice to Pakistan, because nobody in India wants it to happen, right? Because they're driven by the sense of nationalism. They're driven by the sense that Pakistan is a bad actor and India should always uphold that, right? That means at the point at which you go ahead and celebrate the fact that you went ahead and abrogated 370, because you know what, the ends justify the means. At that point in time, when you have that sort of a state and where you have won your election that's really on this narrative, we think it becomes extremely difficult for Modi to simply be nice to Pakistan, which means at that point of time, they realize that Pakistan is shifting away from a country that fucked them over. Why can't they also do the same, right? Which means it is in their own self-interest to go ahead and probably strike a deal that screws over Pakistan in a way that China did as well. That is, Modi can only get acceptance or can appease the public right now only when you create a deal that goes ahead and necessarily puts Pakistan in a very bad position. Probably have leverage over their ports, probably ensure that Indian businesses are far, far better than Pakistan. And the undertone is this: Pakistan is getting fucked over by this deal because they're the weaker party, right? At that point of time is only and only when you as India or like Modi can go ahead and strike such a deal, because he has to ensure that his vote bank, that the people who largely voted him in the first place because of him seeing a great leader against Pakistan, is something that needs to be always appeased, right? Next, with the idea of easing tensions with India as well, right? And this is the entire Kashmir conflict. CG comes and tells you that, look, India is facing some sort of international pressure with regards to what they did in Kashmir, etc. We tell you that India doesn't care. The Senate had a huge discussion over this. They invited people from Kashmir with regards to this, yet nothing happened. All India said in UNSC, etc., through their people, you see on YouTube, you see on so many places where they praise the delegate of India, to go, where they went ahead and said that no international actor should go ahead and involve in personal matters of India. Moreover, we don't think that international pressure is working. The US Senate was the one to call them out. And then what happens? Trump comes to India and is celebrated over here. You have Howdy Modi after the Kashmir deal, right? These sort of things that happen, which goes on to say that their ideas with regards to the fact that, look, there's a lot of international pressure, doesn't necessarily work, because what works for India is the fact that Kashmir is theirs. There's a large sentiments among the Indian populace that Kashmir is theirs, and that no matter what you did in Kashmir with regards to screwing over their rights, with regards to removing the internet from them, all the ends justify the means, and that is what that is what Modi is running on, and that is something he will always have to appease. We do not think that they will somehow want to go ahead and have some sort of any incentive to want to go ahead and form a deal with Pakistan on this, right? Next, and the current narrative is also that India has won this, right? That India, after abolition of 370, India has won Kashmir, and it's all good right now. Next, with the PG, right? Look, organizations like NATO, etc., will side with Pakistan. Two responses. First of all, US is the one spearheading NATO, which means at the point at which US is the one who absolutely hates Pakistan already because of the deals with China, and also because of sort of like Trump can never support Pakistan because Trump's base hates Pakistan. They hate the 9/11 attack. They have strong sentiments against this. He can never support such countries, right? Which means at that point, NATO will never side with this. Moreover, the very functioning of NATO is that they only help their own countries, right? There's a country that are part of the NATO. We don't think that's huge. Next, their main extension, that is the string of pearls, etc. Except they come and tell you that India's current incentive is to screw over the string of pearls, is to try to get a lot of power.
Point from closing.
They don't give you any mechanism to prove to you how that is going to happen, given that China has been called out so many times. You have US ships being placed in South China Sea, yet China still has leverage over all the countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, etc. We don't have any mechanism from them to prove to you how this partnership
Last
with
chance to
Pakistan.
engage with OG.
How go ahead. Sorry.
Last chance for CG.
Last chance for OG.
Yeah. How this partnership with Pakistan will somehow go ahead and increase the leverage over what China has and the hegemony that China has developed all this time. We still think China will always use their reasoning or draw their own map to show that all these areas are still theirs. You don't get any reason whatsoever from them, right? Next, with regards to the comparative, we think when China gives you certain things, what do they give you, right? Currently, they build the Gwadar port in Pakistan. They give you hydropower in Pakistan. They give you a lot of alternate routes that are opened up for various trades like oil and gas, etc. Makes it so much better for Pakistan. They went ahead and give them a lot of arms, etc. to support the Pakistani army. All of these things are given to you from China that likes your country, right? India, they don't give you any proof to show you India will ever give that to you. Next, they talk about India's trade deal, right? That is the narrative that even though that people the trade partners of India only care about the narrative. No, that doesn't necessarily work. Look at US. Everybody hates Saudi and they apply pressure on US to defect, but they don't, because US still gets a lot of benefits from this, right? Countries look at the monetary benefits, not the sort of soft power that exists. Moreover, they don't give you any proof to show you why soft power is beneficial to them in any way whatsoever, right? Lastly, they come and tell you that, look, loans, etc. will be better. Pakistan already gets loans from IMF right now, right? We think these sort of things that already happens and are not necessarily exclusive. Lastly, with regards to the comparative, finally in this debate, we think that the only how to show you a comparative as to why India is a worse actor than China with regards to how bad their economy is, with regards to how bad their data is. They also hide their data. Economists generally reduce 2% of the GDP when they calculate things. All these things are extremely bad, which means as long as China is supporting Pakistan, we think that is the way to go. India will never be nice to you, and you as Imran Khan will never go ahead and fulfill your principal duty towards the citizens. We're very proud to win this debate.
I thank all the speakers for their remarks.
Hi, so the judges will be allocated to a breakout room. You will be offered one on your screen. Please move there to continue discussion. In the meantime,